Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for being here. This episode is a special one for me for a couple of reasons. First, and mainly because it was opportunity to talk with Susie Turner, Principal Educational Psychologist and Inclusion Manager at Perth and Kinross Council. Susie was my Principal Educational Psychologist, and I still aspire to the lessons and ways of practice that she modelled every day. They were absolutely grounded in a drive to do what is best for children and young people with integrity and courage. I consider myself lucky to have learnt from her for a number of years. We discuss her career journey, starting from her training to now, and in that get some insight into her key influences, how the profession has evolved, and what she thinks should remain central to our work. The second reason this episode feels special is because I'd now love to invite you to participate in part of my PhD research. Since starting this podcast, the links between it and what my research has been trying to achieve has grown, and I'm now curious about how the podcast may or may not have supported your understanding of the EP role, your interests, or other areas that are important to you. You don't need to be an EP or trainee EP to participate, just anyone who has listened to any episode is welcome to give their views. Parents, young people, EPs, trainee EPs, managers are all very welcome. Your role is not important, although you will be asked to indicate the capacity in which you listen, and that's just to help me understand more about the audience. I've created a website, which is www.gillianorb.com. So that's www.gillianorb, all one word, .com. And more information is available there by following the link How to Get Involved, which will take you to more information, links to participant information sheets, and the quick survey, which can be completed anonymously. You will also have opportunity, should you prefer, to record your feedback using a device and upload it by following a link to a secure shared drive. The second way you could participate, and you can do both, is through a small group discussion facilitated by me and after I've had initial findings from the survey. So there's information about that on the website as well, and a link to where you can give your contact details and whether or not you'd like to be involved in that. You're not disadvantaged, of course, in any way for not taking part. Any feedback that you can give will be most genuinely appreciated. Anyway, back to this episode, and to say again how grateful I am to Susie for this conversation and being able to share it here. We hope you enjoy and can find some value in it. So a huge welcome to Susie Turner, who is the Principal Educational Psychologist and Inclusion Manager at Perth and Kinross Council.
Thank you, Julian. Good to be with you.
Oh, lovely. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, actually. And for those who don't know, I was lucky enough to have Susie as my Principal Educational Psychologist for, I think, 4 or 5 years. I think you started in 2014 or 15.
It was
in Perth.
It was the later part of 2013.
Oh, was it 2013? All right, I should have checked my facts.
Getting on now.
Oh gosh, right, okay. Yeah, until when I left late 2018.
Okay.
And we talk a lot about the power of having behaviours and values modelled to us, social learning and all of that kind of thing. And I feel like I struck gold when you came along to Perth and I was working there. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the reasons why later. So I'm really grateful to you for giving up your time today. Just to get us started, I suppose, would you mind giving us a bit of an introduction? I know I did the bare bones there. Maybe just where you trained, the jobs you've had since you trained, anything that you would want to say about that and where you're at now. That would be great.
Yeah, I trained at Strathclyde University, 2001 to 2003. I was a trainee at Falkirk Council and then went on to do my probationary year then. That was a really exciting time for that service. It had been reduced for various and some quite unfortunate reasons, just down to 2 working EPs, and was really being built back up again. And that was, I think, an opportunity for the service to re-emerge and to re-establish itself and to think about the kind of service it wanted to be. So it was a really interesting, formative time to be a trainee and a
Mm.
probationer, and I worked there for 5 years until
Mhm.
2008. And I moved then as depute into Stirling Council, and I was with Stirling Council for 5 years. That was quite a different experience in terms of the field of inclusion, because Stirling didn't really have many specialist provisions. It had a very good staged intervention system. Inclusion was really well owned by the school practitioners there. So that was a really interesting experience. And we went through a change where some of the resources were additionally devolved out to
Mhm.
schools. So that watching how that happened and being a part of that
Mm.
was really interesting. And to see the further ownership of inclusion. Then I moved to be principal in Perth, which was my hometown, later in 2013. And you asked at the very beginning about my role here, which is principal educational psychologist and inclusion manager. I am part and always have been part of the inclusion management team. I am not the person responsible for inclusion and additional support needs, and I've
Mhm.
never held any part of the inclusion budget. I think in many ways, although I've got that in my title, it is very
Mhm.
similar to my
Mhm.
colleagues across Scotland in terms of, I chair one of the internal panels, and I know that that would be similar from my
Yeah.
ASPEB colleagues.
Oh, I didn't know many of those things about you, actually. There's loads of questions I want to ask about, more just out of curiosity. When you were a trainee, that must have been really interesting, like you say, trainee working in Falkirk, was it you said initially,
Yes.
where they
Yeah.
were having to rebuild the
Yeah.
service?
Yeah.
Can you remember back to how they went about doing that? Are the kinds of things that supported that to move things in a helpful direction?
Yeah. Yeah. What was interesting was, so I worked in the third sector in Falkirk and Stirling and Clackmannanshire at the time. What was Central
Mhm.
Region? Gosh, this is really
Yeah.
going back.
Yeah.
So I had some experience on the periphery of an educational psychology service that had diminished and diminished. And I recall one of the big secondary schools effectively saying, well, we don't really miss them. We don't really need educational
Mm.
psychology. And it was Charles Gibb who came in as principal and Graham King as depute. And they really brought with them a consultation model, which
Mhm.
would have been a change of direction that time. Um, and when I say consultation model, I think it was important to also be clear that there was a lot of focus on casework within that, but the basis was consultation. And I remember that same school saying to me as a trainee, probably just 18 months forward from that original comment of, what a value they saw in the service they had been provided, and how that, they didn't
Okay.
feel they would, want anything other than to continue with it.
Mm.
And I remember thinking, gosh, what a change around. And I think some of that almost inevitably comes down to respect of personality, down to the how people go about things, and listening, I think, to the schools at the time and what the schools needed.
Okay, so I had a feeling this might happen. I wanted to jump ahead to some of the other questions I wanted to ask, but the how people do things. So you have obviously had so much experience in different services and different places and at different points in time. What is it that you have found about the how that seems to be really helpful? So not just, I guess, skills, but kind of good EP practice that you've seen that just seems to kind of get it right, if you like.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a hard one to distill sometimes, isn't it? But I'm interested in how different people might think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, it is a hard question in some ways, but it's a really important and fundamental one, isn't it? And I think for me, and it's going to look different in different situations, it's all about interactions, isn't it? But it's about some sort of mixture, which is about being alongside of stakeholders and of schools. A bit of humility in that. I think we're in a very privileged position, aren't we, where we walk into situations and we walk back out again. And we have to be able to recognize that and acknowledge that. So it's that along with all the kind of things you're going to expect me to say about good communication skills and empathy and listening and reflecting back. But there's also something about then both having good content knowledge. So really knowing your stuff, being able to use that appropriately to support other people in coming to their solutions and in their knowledge, but doing that from a basis of a level of, and I am going to use this word, expert knowledge. Um, and then I think there's something about holding the line that keeps a focus on children and young people. So within respectful relationships, bringing things back to what children and young people need and keeping a focus on that. And so people that you are working with in schools will trust that that is what you are going to do. It's where your focus is. And hopefully there's a bit of mutual respect around that. So you're not just going to tell me what I might want to hear in this moment. You're not just going to sit down and have a nice cup of tea. You're not going to please yourself. These are all bottom lines, aren't they? But actually, you have something of value for the progression of children and young people, and I can rely on that. And that means that sometimes you might be challenging to to my practice, but that's okay because you can do it in a safe way.
Yeah, yeah. What you just said about keeping children and young people at the centre is something I really remember about in any conversations I had with you. That was a principle that really stuck with me. If I was stuck, feeling confused about which next step, I was really grateful to come to you. You were really responsive, and you've got this mantra in my head now of keep the child and young person at the centre. Where are they? What do they need? What are they experiencing? And obviously, we would all like to think that's what we do anyway. But I think it's hard sometimes when you get caught up in the complexity of a situation, actually, just for someone to say, where's the child and young person? What's in their best interests right now? And have we done that? Is that being addressed?
Yeah, I think it's the compass, the thing that can and should guide our work. Situations can get really complex, can't they? Around children and young people, all kinds of levels, all kinds of dynamics and relationships and statutory functions. But if we can bring it back down to this, I would hold by that will be the thing that will keep us right. We don't do it to keep us right. Because it's the right thing to do the right thing by children and young people. And that's actually what the profession is there for. But I think sometimes that means driving quite a hard path, driving perhaps quite an isolated path. It means being out on a limb. It means being challenged when you're out on a limb. And that's really hard. And so when I say it'll keep us right, I hold on to if we are able to continue to keep the child in mind and do the right thing by the child, then I think it means that in doing the right thing, we can be assured that we have done what we can and done the right thing, and we can hopefully hold that there is a level of protection in that as well. And I really like to talk about protection, but we are probably increasingly somewhat in a more adversarial field at times. So there is that aspect to it.
And is that for you? Because when you're talking about that, that makes me think of how we're able to like justify our work. And that word feels a bit defensive or something. But to me, that means, are we clear about why we're making certain decisions, what that's based on, in what way is that in the best interest of the child or young person or family who's involved? You know, it's having some confidence to say, well, I took this action because of this, this, and this. Acknowledging that that also had a knock-on effect and that, and that, but these are complex situations. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Mm.
interesting, Gillian, and giving a bit of thought to this over the last couple of weeks. I went and looked up because I couldn't remember his name. That says something, I think, about my age and stage. I went and looked up the name of Jeremy J. Monsen, who developed the Monsen model, which was big when I was practicing, and came up and spoke to us at Strathclyde
Right.
University. And he was part of the teaching team at UCL and said something that was really powerful for me at the time and really stayed with me. And I hope I've kept to, I don't know if it's always possible, that he said that you should, as an EP, be able to stop at any moment in time and know why you're doing what you're doing. Right. So I don't think he really meant, filling in your travel expenses form or whatever. But I think it was more, if you like, stringent academic evidence based, knowing why you had chosen to do one thing rather than another, knowing why you might have prompted staff to look at this particular area, or you might have given this particular advice, knowing on what evidential basis
Yeah.
you had done that. Yeah.
And it's so helpful to be reminded of that, isn't it? And one of the things I, again, feel like a lot of the things I speak about here, it's like things that sound obvious after the fact. But when it came to this job and looking at the core competencies and the section on research, and just the mirroring between the section on research, all the principles that we would talk to about good research, and actually a lot of that underpins, we would say, all of EP practice, and we would hope that it does anyway. Similar
Yeah.
kind of principle, isn't it? Yeah. And what you were saying as well about, sometimes making those decisions or holding true to those values can feel isolating, or it can feel challenging because you might be like the lone voice, was making me think of the self-evaluation work that you did. And I know the
Yeah.
paper that I'm thinking of was in
Yeah.
2010 or something, but it's one that I have, and actually just before summer, pinged forward to a couple of trainees who are keen to think about how they're evaluating their practice next year when they go in to be a third year. It was reminding me, because there was note there of, well, the importance of feedback is that we kind of need to ask, and it might feel uncomfortable to do so. We might get information back that we don't maybe agree with, or it might not feel particularly nice, but it's quite important.
Yeah. And so I've been doing a little bit of name checking, haven't I? So it's
Yeah,
really
please
important,
do.
I think, at this point to mention Lisa Randall was my practice tutor, and I was really fortunate to have had her as my practice tutor. And she was the one, really, the ideas and the drive behind the self-evaluation. And again, a really interesting time 20 years ago for educational psychology, because Education Scotland, or as it was then, were beginning to talk about inspecting educational
Yeah.
psychology services. And there was a bit of a backlash within the profession at that time, a bit of a sense of, well, you're not going to be able to evidence my trail of work. And actually, I give advice. So you're going to have to go and look at school files for that. But actually, that, if you unpick that, I think you could probably argue that it's
Yeah.
probably a bit arrogant. Who would think that they could be in a job and not either take feedback for their own self-reflection and their own improvement, or be subject to a bit of analysis, where, is public money that has trained us and is supporting our work. But the challenge was then on how to do it, how to try it and capture in a way that was reflective of the role. And then I know that one of Lisa's points was, we are social scientists. We should be able to answer this for ourselves. And, start small and let's look at this. And what do we know about good evaluation? Well, that involves triangulation. So, let's think about what we think about a piece of work, but let's ask. Let's ask. But the asking was challenging. People, and they still don't. We still have those conversations, people not liking to ask. because they don't want the attention turned on themselves. And then practical reasons. If I ask now, I might open up this conversation that has now actually moved on. And, we shouldn't be asking when it isn't at a time that's appropriate for stakeholders. That is clear. But it is equally clear that we should be asking. And that can be really useful both for supervision and personal development. It's important as a team. A team should plan based on, just in part, the feedback it's getting. And we also, and I understand this much better now in my role, we need to be able to say to our line managers, to elected members, not just what we do, but this is the difference it makes and it can make.
And sorry, I should jump back. For those who are not aware, I'm talking about a paper written by Susie Turner, Lisa Randall, and Azra Mohammed in 2010. And I think it was called something Are we doing effective work? Doing an effective job. So I'll include the link in the notes. And when I was an EP in Perth and Kinross, it was introduced to us. And what I remember noticing and really liking about it is that it incorporated our own self-reflection as EPs, how did you think it went? But it also asked for process feedback. And I think that the point was that we can sometimes rely on that a bit too heavily. We just get the process feedback and also what the outcomes have been. Yes. And it felt like a very easy, proportionate way to gather holistic feeling of information to help shed some light on how has this gone actually? What difference did it actually make? And then there was a section too, wasn't there, about what systemic implication might that have? Which systems work might be doing. Yeah. Yeah. Have you had any reflections since then or any additions to that or anything that now if you were to be writing a paper or designing a pro forma, it would look different or the same, or are the same challenges still there?
I think some of the same challenges are still there. I think where we've developed it in Perth and Kinross, we've done a little bit more thinking around a kind of bit of a distinction between outcome and impact. Okay, so the outcome might be that the young person is now attending maths class, for example, but the impact might be beyond that. So, it's different again from process. It's different from how was it to be involved with an educational psychologist and how is communication. But the impact might be that they're now feeling much more confident. That confidence has meant that they felt able to come up with a revision timetable, that they felt able to rejoin, I don't know, a gaming club or something like that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that, because the outcome could be quite concrete.
Yes.
And sometimes outcomes can be quite minimal, but the impact can be quite significant. So it's trying to capture both of that. We've also, in Perth and Kinross, had some really useful discussions as part of team meetings, bringing a completed casework evaluation, we call it, and then looking at themes across the team and talking in small groups with each other and a bit of support and challenge. And that is fascinating as well, because other EPs notice things didn't notice. That's helpful just as part of general professional development and team connectedness as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it, because I think when we hear evaluation, it makes it sound like, oh, it's scrutiny. But what I remember about that process is that it actually felt like you're taking ownership of your development and the work that you're doing. And it also felt supportive. And I think that is especially important just now, isn't it? With, all jobs are busy. EPs are very, very busy. And it's a very demanding job sometimes. So EP wellbeing, we need to be thinking about that as well.
You definitely do.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's anything that in the service people have been doing that's been really helpful.
Yeah, it is increasingly important. I think I would say that. And it was really interesting. We looked at a team at the recent revision of the HCPC standards and the focus there
Yeah.
on the kind of personal responsibility more around well-being. And during the pandemic, it was something that we really thought about. And we looked at organizational well-being, some of the work from Bruce Perry, and that was really interesting at the time, and have continued to look at what we're doing, look at what we can influence around connectedness as a team, and look at how that feels and how we're managing ourselves. The team changes, so some of the discussion might change and we might adapt, but it's definitely an important focus. I think there's something for me that's always important, but arguably I think it's even more important in the current context in which we're working, and that it is about self-awareness,
Yeah.
but not relying on so peer hearings and having somebody else that you are going to, good line management structures as well are really important. But knowing the current term probably is what are your triggers, knowing what you stop doing when you're becoming overwhelmed, knowing what you need to do, knowing how to prompt that if you've stopped doing it. The really important mechanisms, that's where the self-awareness comes.
Yeah. You mentioned the organizational well-being. It's sort of the system stuff as well as the knowing yourself stuff as well, isn't it? It's kind of the balance between those two, I suppose. Yeah.
I'm just thinking, Gillian, some of the name checking I've been doing, and we should have said it was Elaine McGuffick, one of the APs in the service who brought the organizational well-being tool. We were really grateful that she did that. And
That sounds good.
helpful. Yeah.
Is that freely available?
We probably, we would have it somewhere.
Okay, well, we can maybe see if we can get that from you if you don't mind. That would be fantastic. Okay, so what I would love to come back to now is when you were talking about the content. I think you used the words content knowledge, and we've maybe covered quite a lot of this already, but I'm really quite interested in that as well. I think that's the line, at least my PhD started in. It's sort of taken many twists and turns. And I'm just curious around what would you see within that content knowledge? If you were thinking, there's a great EP, they're really knowledgeable, what would you think of them as having knowledge of or sort of being expert in, if you see what I mean? Or anything that springs to mind when you're...
What a good question. And I think probably the first thing that we need to acknowledge is an absolute understanding that not all EPs can be knowledgeable in all areas. And there is that bit about knowing where to go to get that knowledge. I think there's something fundamental about how children learn to read and write. Okay? And I think with the focus on well-being and mental health, we could lose sight of just how core that is to our job. And this is probably a good point for me to say I'm now a bit dodgy and a bit of a fraud talking about this, because in my role, I think some of my CPD has taken me away from some of the very content knowledge that I believe EPs need to hold. So I say that absolutely, holding my hands up. Yeah. So literacy and numeracy, having knowledge around them, it is really important. Rising rates of autism. Do we have a really refined understanding of that? I think that's important. And there is fundamentally what do we understand about well-being and resilience within a highly digital world for our children and young people, and trauma. These things are important, but I think we talked about the importance of the compass of doing the right thing for children and young people. That's within the frame of educational need. That is our core area of competence. What's the impact of this for teaching and learning? What's the impact of this for the educational program? That's where we need to kind of hold our sphere. That's what we have to go back to.
Yeah. When I first started doing my PhD, I was sort of aware of feeling tensions around maybe in the past thinking I don't know enough or I should be knowing more about certain things. So I sat down and wrote a list of all the things that I thought EPs, a good EP would be expert in. And it was an unmanageable amount of things.
Yeah.
I would say. So I feel as though conversations about, well, what do we want to be expert in or what do we want to have good sound knowledge in would be quite useful. Maybe it was just me, I don't know, but there's so much that we can know or find out about. But what are the things that we really want to be quite clear on? And as you say, it might look different for different people, but what is it even within a team, I suppose?
Yeah.
I don't know,
That we need to be able to
yeah,
cover.
yeah,
Yeah.
to cover.
I think it's making me think as I have been back to when I started and we mentioned the consultation model.
Yeah.
And we all know and understand how important that is to have that
Mhm.
as your fundamental bedrock. But I also hold quite firmly, I think, to that doesn't mean that we should be reticent in coming forward with content knowledge and
Mhm.
advice as
Yeah.
appropriate. We know that to support other people to find solutions
Mhm.
is the best way forward. It's sustainable. But I think, and actually your podcast with Jennifer King
Mhm.
pulled this out really well.
Yeah.
It isn't enough just to collate information. We have to be able to analyze that. We can only provide effective analysis if we've got a good understanding of
Yeah.
content. We
Yeah.
have to be systematic, probably about how we go about that too. And so there's something about holding to consultation and to good problem ownership, but feeling empowered as appropriate to give advice and
Yeah.
to talk through areas of content. And within that, I think there's something about recognizing, and hopefully we do all do this, but the power of the role. And so we
Mhm.
need to be really careful about where power lies in any given situation. And again, I think you've explored this in some of your podcasts, whose voice is not being heard, what we're going to do about that. But it's interesting because I think the influence assumed of experts is absolutely diminishing, in all kinds of ways. But there is still influence and power in a
Mhm.
professional role. And sometimes I think we shouldn't be afraid to use that.
Yeah.
I think we are highly educated, highly paid employees of a local authority who are alongside of schools and alongside of parents, but stand and should stand somewhat separate at the same time. And that gives a position, I think, of privilege, but
Mhm.
it also gives the ability to be bold on behalf of children and young people. That's not throwing weight around, that's not overusing that. But I think sometimes, and perhaps a little bit more recently, but I think throughout my management career, I've encouraged EPs, and I've said, well, actually, you're the one to go, no, this isn't quite good enough. Or you're
Yeah.
the one to say, why aren't we having another
Mhm.
meeting? You're
Mhm.
the one to say, we need to talk to this parent again.
Mhm.
Actually,
Mhm.
if we can't get them to come in, can we just blooming go out and do a home visit? But you're the one to
Yeah.
be bold and clear in a meeting, and I think that's an important part. Started talking about content knowledge.
No, no, I love it. No, yeah, no. And I remember that and I appreciated that as well because I think sometimes when things are complex, it does take someone, and quite often I think the EP is
Yeah,
just as well placed as anyone, if not better,
yeah,
to be a leader. And that's kind of what the conversation with Jen was about, actually. She was
yeah,
saying
yeah,
sometimes it is the EP role. And it came up in Jen's episode. It also came up, perhaps prompted maybe a little bit in Sarah's episode as well, maybe others as well. It's, I guess, leadership skills that EPs have and how we use those and how does that interact with things like you're talking about, like power and how we're perceived. So what you've just said, I think, links really nicely to what I was going to ask you about. I was wondering if there's anything else you would add to that, or any influences you've seen throughout your career, or people or experiences that demonstrated what you would think of as like good EP leadership that has informed how you think about it at the moment, or would want to be thinking about it.
Yeah, I would probably go back to Charles Gibb and Graham King and Lisa Randall. And I think I remember Charles being quite honest, actually, talking about his own early years as an educational psychologist. So he was
Mhm.
somebody who could be very incisive, very clear, call a spade, and then more. But his early career experiences saying that it was by going out with other EPs, as you do as a trainee and a probationer, and thinking, "Oh, right, you can say this. Oh, it's okay to say this
Mhm.
kind of thing. Oh, yes, right enough. Who else is going to say that?
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely, it's also, of course, the right thing to do in some situations to be very quiet, isn't
Yeah.
it? You know, and that in itself sometimes is a form of leadership. Also worked in Falkirk with somebody who, before emails, used to spend an awful lot of time on the phone preparing for meetings. Really talking with a
That's
parent,
interesting. Yes.
talking with the member of staff at the school. And I shadowed her, and sometimes she'd say quite a bit in meetings, other times she would say very little, but she'd always done whatever she could to consider what was needed at the
Mhm.
meeting, what the dynamics were, and therefore what the preparation should be. I also think, Gillian, and this is something that I don't know, is the word almost kind of like bothered me a little bit throughout my career. But when we're talking about EPs as leaders, I'm talking about being bold. I think I also said earlier, it's important to me that we're also quite humble and we act with
Yeah.
humility at times. And there are other practitioners who have very good skills and very good content knowledge as well. And it is not an arena that's held just by us. And what's bothered me, if I'm thinking aloud here, is I think it's really important to value our skills and our content knowledge and to value that for ourselves. And I really admire EPs who are very confident in what their role can offer.
Yeah.
But I'm very fortunate throughout my career, and particularly now, to work with people who are not EPs,
Mhm.
who are very skilled at how they go about things and have really good levels of knowledge around additional support needs and schools
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
systems.
Yeah.
And
I think that's a really good point, and it's something as well to me that is making me wonder about: are we clear about where we see the psychology? And it's that the
yeah,
unique role kind of thing.
yeah,
And back to what you were saying at the start about, if we were to put a pause on this now, are we clear about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why we as psychologists are doing it? And sometimes for me, I certainly found it's like, well, there is a role there. And I know I've had supervisors in the past who would say, well, just because you can speak French doesn't mean you should be a French teacher. But that was always a bit of a dilemma for me. It's where you can see a need and there was a gap there. And actually, I'm not sure if this is my job or someone else's, but it's someone's. There's a need there, that thinking about the child at the center. So if not me, then can I take action to support someone else
yeah,
to be able to see what might
yeah,
be useful there? Or I'm being a bit clunky with my words, but there's something that can feel quite difficult about that. But what helped was feeling confident in knowledge, as you say, around, okay, well, I'm thinking this because of that, because of the research that I've learned about what supports brain development or what supports literacy or whatever, that this feels an important thing to happen. And it makes
yeah,
the conversation a bit more specific about then, okay, so who might be able
yeah.
to do that? Yeah. So yeah, interesting things, and not necessarily easy things, are they? It's
No, and
talk about them, but
Yeah, and what you said there about seeing need, but it's not
Mm,
necessarily my job, that's huge challenge. If the public sector funding squeeze gets
yeah.
worse,
Mhm.
then those kind of situations are gonna, trouble us more. And it's really these things are really hard, because then I think you get into questions of, to how big is the need, and
Yeah.
if I do that, what is it that I'm not going to be able to do?
Yeah.
Demand versus need is another area that I think is challenging.
It's complex stuff,
Public
isn't it?
sector at
Yeah.
the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember again, what really helped me was when we had a team discussion over a development day, I think it was, about casework priorities. And not too long qualified at that point. Maybe to everyone else, it was like, well, this is just, straightforward stuff. But for me, it was hugely helpful for as a team to just think about what are our casework priorities? Here are a range of scenarios that could present themselves to you. How would you go about thinking about
Yeah.
whether or not this is something that you would take a next step in or get involved in a
Yeah.
consultation with or open up a case about?
Yeah.
And I think in the end, I remember the outcome of that was both how critical is the situation as well as the early intervention.
Yeah.
Those kind of
Yeah.
two opposite ends of the scale, but having a mind to
Try to
both
balance. Yeah.
and trying to balance those. And there's a bit of risk assessment in there as well,
Yeah.
using that word in a non-formal way, I suppose, but about,
Yeah.
just how critical is this situation and what
Yeah.
needs to happen. I find that really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And because a service, an input from any practitioner has to be focused, doesn't it,
Yes.
to be
Yeah.
effective? And I also think we were, talking there about staff well-being within a context of, we know, increasing need. So one of the things I think that helps just boundary that, and contain it, is by keeping people quite focused on their core area
Yeah.
of work.
Yeah. Yeah. And the balance between child and young person at the centre, my core area of work, who else is involved, and what, that kind of broad assessment of the situation as well.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I think so the bit that can feel challenging for me sometimes when I'm trying to think with trainees and also thinking about my own experience is the recognition that we should be having high expectations of ourselves. I believe that. I think we need to take, ownership over our learning and development and things as well. And also be aware that of that incredibly long list of expertise that we could assign ourselves without even knowing it. And we need to be aware of that too. So what you're saying about being quite clear as a team can be really helpful around, well, these are the things we're prioritizing. So these
Yeah.
are the things that are amber if you're traffic lighting them, or red, and we're not going to touch for now because these are the
Yeah.
priorities. Because it's all of this, I think it's making me think anyway about practitioner well-being too, around
Yes.
how are we getting the balance right across that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Let me just have a wee look down at my notes because I feel like we've covered so much, but maybe not in the way that I thought.
Like any good conversation.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose I was keen to ask you about decision making because that's something that I wonder about for EPs. I know we've covered a lot in relation to that already. I guess what I was thinking about when I delighted you were coming on was, I wonder if Susie has any principles or things that she has a little mini framework in her mind or something when making decisions within complex situations, because that was something I remember observing with you. Like I say, I would maybe be feeling there's all these variables, all these different factors, and you were really quickly and really supportively able to distill it. So I didn't know if that was um, just from experience, but I thought I'd love to ask if there's anything in terms of a decision making framework or principles. I know we've spoken
Yeah.
about some of those already, but anything else that kind of comes to mind?
Yeah. I don't think I do have work. But it is, and I'm quite sure don't absolutely won't always get it right and won't always use it when perhaps should. But it is that, what is the right thing to do? not which is
Yeah.
a different question from what's going to resolve this, what's this going to get this off my desk, what's not going to create a fuss. Actually, what is the right thing to do, not for the parent, not for the school, but for the child or young person. And within that educational frame, because the right thing to do might be for them to have some input so they can get back in the car again after a car accident. But actually, we're about classrooms. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what one of the, I mean, so you can ask me that question and I can give you that answer, and it sounds quite straightforward. And I think I spoke at the beginning about if we do take that approach, it may well be bumpy, but it should keep everything right. But I think if we left it there, we wouldn't be giving enough recognition to some of the complexities. And I think we are in interesting times because there's rising need, there's rising accessibility and pressure on public service. There's less faith in public service, and I think an erosion of sort of the respect for institutions and professionals. And I also think that our ASL legislation gives quite a lot of power, some of it rightly, but quite a lot of power to parents. And where is the expertise and the role of the education professional? Is the balance right through that legislation is a query I think I have, and I think is part of the fueling of the rising demand. So I think some of the hard questions that we face are the demand versus need. So while I can I can get on my high horse and talk about doing the right thing, if you've got a statutory placing request that you have to respond to that takes up time and energy, in one level, you're not doing the right thing because you're not meeting
Your hands are
the
tied.
need,
Yeah.
because your hands are tied by responding to this, which isn't necessarily about meeting need. As a system, I think we are challenged, increasingly challenged and challenged at the moment to always do the right
Yeah.
for children and young
Yeah.
people. And I think I think it's hard for practitioners at the moment. And when there's a real resilience and agility that is needed to keep on answering some of these questions and managing the demand, because we do in Perth and Kinross, we don't have a strict time allocation model. We have reasons for not doing so. We put a lot of responsibility and onus on the shoulders of individual practitioners, and they are highly educated and highly paid, and they are choosing to step into that. But it is hard on an everyday, some of these decisions.
Yeah. It's really tension laden, isn't it? Because of
Yeah.
those two kind of competing bits. Any thoughts around what might support change in that way, or what might be useful in terms, and I mean, I know we're probably talking about big systems change now at this point, we're talking about the law, but any sense of, it'd be so much better if this was the case, or if we could have these conversations, or
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, well, you have to have faith, don't you, that there can be change and that the change will be for the better. We can't swing back to where it's all in the favor of professionals and the voices of children and young people and diminished. We can't have that, but there has to be, I think, some. This isn't an answer, but there has to be some sort of national debate and reckoning around how to best manage limited public resources. That's actually what we're talking about. But we are talking about it within a context of evidence rising need. That it's a bit, what do we want to spend our money on as a nation? Who in the political system is going to grasp that mantle is a question, but I think things will almost inevitably come to a head, but it'd be better to be ahead of that curve,
Yeah.
those discussions.
Yeah. Are any of
But
those discussions happening? Do you know?
yeah, I mean, I think it's never been more important to be part of a national voice, as DEP, as
Mm.
PEP, ADIS. Yes, I think these things are being raised, but they're really hard questions, aren't they?
Absolutely. Very complicated stuff, isn't it? But just hearing you summarize it as that, that's actually the question, isn't it? How do we think these pots of money would be best spent?
Yeah,
And how are we going to, that filters down to where we
yeah.
allocate resources and where things go where.
And
And
how we
that
build our
probably
legislation.
helps with some of that organizational well-being stuff,
Yeah, yes.
doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
The conversation I had with James, he mentioned he was talking about some of his work in trauma. And I think he said something along the lines of, well, actually, I think what we're seeing a lot of the time is traumatized systems that are under stress in ways that can't quite work out how to get out of it yet.
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
there?
And
Yeah.
to take ourselves out of the busyness, to say, what are the questions? What can we influence? And hard to do. We know it's hard to do, but it is important to do.
Absolutely. The time to think. There's
Yeah.
another reference. Yeah. Okay. I was keen to ask you influences on your practice. I think I did ask that near the start. Is there anyone else or any other experiences that, because I've jumped us about all over the place, that we've not spoken about that you would like to give mention to or to recognize that we've not maybe touched on so far? We've had so many already.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many of the EPs that I've worked with across the
Yeah.
years, have influenced, continue to influence, and are very valuable colleagues. But I was, in listening to some of your podcasts, hearing people's stories of why they think they went into
Mhm.
psychology, and it was
Mhm.
making me think and it was making me smile. And is probably the point at which to say, so I am a product of my mum was a social worker, medical social worker, sort of trained in specific roles. And my dad was a Methodist minister. And my mum
Mm.
and dad, after they had me and my brother, my mum didn't go back to work, but they decided to foster children, which was really interesting when I was, quite young, when we were 6, 7, 8, 9. And so really vivid memories of children who had very different routines and
Mhm.
expectations from us. And I think when you're 6 and 7, you think that everybody has their tea
There's
at this
one way to do
time.
it. Yeah.
That's what they have. They have to go to bed at
Yeah.
this time. This is what their parents say to them in the morning.
Yes.
And we had a little toddler who was in his high chair who kept crying and pointing, and my mum and dad were giving him milk and they were giving him water and they were giving him juice. And eventually they worked out he was pointing at the teapot and they gave him some tea and he
Oh,
downed it,
wow.
and for me that was like, what,
Yeah.
you know, and another experiences like that, and one little girl who shared my bedroom and who cried herself to sleep in the evenings, and her dad was preparing to have her back to live with him, and we went with her to visit him, and he had been up all night painting her bedroom. And for me, the concept that you didn't have
Yeah.
to go to bed, that you
Yeah.
could not sleep, was just out of this
That was
world.
an option.
That was an option. And then just one last story. They had, my mum and dad, I think, a 15 or 16-year-old boy. I don't really remember that, but he did apparently just walk out one day. And apparently the day or two after that, I put on my coat and said, that's it. I'm going.
He's shown me the way.
So as far as the front door, and then the plan just, yeah. So
Yeah.
just those experiences of people, I guess in quite a sort of child appropriate way, gave me an
Mhm.
interest in the experiences of other people. And then, because my dad was a Methodist minister, we had to move every now and every 5 years or so. We moved when I was 10 in the summer holidays. So we moved from the northeast of England to Edinburgh. And I had just missed the very start of term. So it was the middle of the English summer holidays. All
Okay.
these systems around
Oh.
England. And I moved into the second or third day of this Scottish term and started school and didn't have a uniform. We didn't have a uniform when I was at primary school in England. Uniform was a big thing. So I started this new school, having just moved the day before, without a uniform. And, my name is Susie. I've got a Sunday name. And I was introduced to this class in my Sunday name. And, just thinking, did anybody ask me? This is awful.
Right.
And not just a new accent and new ways of doing things, but almost a new language. I can remember at break time, a little boy coming up to me and saying, I ken your wee brother. You what, my little brother? Do I have to be worried about him? Oh my goodness. What does that mean? Yeah. And actually, and break time, I think I had seen a packet of crisps about once a month.
Yeah.
And there were all these kids.
Not the way in Scotland.
All these kids every break time. And it
Yeah.
wasn't a snack, it was a play piece. Well, what's that? But
Oh, how interesting,
then
though.
an interesting thing happened because I ended up having a term of remedial support in the corridor with the head teacher, who was lovely. And actually, I think it all felt okay. And my dad explaining how good the Scottish education system was, and I just hadn't had the same thing that the other children had had, which I think was probably true. But there was something, I think, around, like long division or something. And I do remember the head teacher saying to me, after about a week or something, you can do this. You can already do this. And me thinking, yes, I can already do it. Why couldn't I do it last week when they tested me? And of course, now I think, yeah, because your whole brain was focused on not having
Flooded
to
on.
do
Yeah.
and all of those experiences.
Oh,
So
good.
I think, that now, thinking about it now, probably gave me quite an interest in how children learn.
Yeah.
And the principles of my parents, and hats off to them, very focused on care for the people around about you and doing the right thing and contributing.
Yeah. And that you live that, I think. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Those experiences that will have really helped experience actually like what helps in those situations and what didn't help. And
Yes.
that lived experience of that is so powerful, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also, obviously highlighting the importance of what we take for granted, which links, doesn't it, to the important cultural questions we need to be thinking about too, in terms of where are our assumptions coming from? Where is our judgment coming from? What's that based in? And that's back to that clear about all of that stuff as
Yeah.
a practitioner. Have we asked ourselves the right questions?
Yeah. Are we using the evidence base? What might our potential biases be?
Absolutely. And
All
where has
of
the
that.
evidence base come from, actually? Is there another evidence base?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
So
thanks
you're
for
making
sharing
me
those
think,
stories.
Juliet,
Yeah.
I do need a framework in my head.
Well, you do very well without it, is what I would say. But I'm a frameworks person. Okay. I don't know where the time has gone, Susie. I'm really aware of it, and I'm really aware you're a very busy person. What I'd maybe like to ask about, we've really talked so much, and I've loved it about EP practice. Do you have any, or what are your hopes? If you were thinking 5-10 years time, EP practice would look like this, it would feel like this, would be doing these things. Is there anything that comes to mind or anything you've thought about in relation to that? I know we've spoken about some things already.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because every now and then people say, the curry functions, do we need to adapt them? And I'd be really up for discussions about that. But I think in general, that ability to go from casework to systems is so important, and to work in context. And that's it's the unique contribution, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a real strength. I think my wish would be that we'd be able to promote that strength across government in a way that's easily understood, valued, and gives clarity with clinical colleagues. But that's talking about standing and respect. And that, I think I would want to see that there was adequate space and time for EPs to be able to contribute in the ways that they can that make the biggest difference. Some of what we've spoken about all the noise in the system about demand that isn't necessarily need. My biggest wish would be not just for us, for schools, for clinical colleagues as well, we would have got a better understanding as a society around how best to use the services at our disposal. Yeah.
Yeah. And I suppose this links on any kind of requests or asks of future EPs, current EPs, or anything along those lines, next steps or things that might support moving that direction.
I think, well, I think on one quite practical level, I think for people entering the profession to enter it with the recognition that this is hard. This is a hard context to be in. There is something about the context is hard, which means that children and young people need what we can offer and what schools can give more than ever. So there's a real sense of responsibility there, but to recognize that is what we're stepping into. And for those of us that are in it, to recognize that there's a level of choice there and this is what we're doing. In terms of calls to action, I think it is about acting as national networks, acting together. So you're talking to me, aren't you, from Dundee University? And let's remember what can be gained by working collaboratively for some of these wicked issues. And on an individual and collective level, just making sure that we do have the time to think and that we do come together to try and problem solve and to influence where we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's maybe something I would want to highlight actually from my experience is that I think I said, and you said as well, having the high expectations, it's a hard job. We should be taking ownership of that. And within that, what makes such a difference, isn't it, in terms of EP wellbeing, is feeling like a collaborative and feeling like there's support there and there's challenge there, but it's safe feeling. It's psychologically safe feeling.
That's important, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard work. So you want to feel like there's support there as well to hold us accountable as well, but in a supportive, human-centered way. That can be a bit of a game changer, can't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Fabulous. Okay, something I tend to ask most people. You've given us so many different tips and kind of words of wisdom, but I'm always keen to just ask near the end, any bits of advice or other things that we've spoken about, maybe for EPs and thinking a lot about trainee EPs who are maybe coming out, anything that we've not spoken about.
Yeah, so there's the bit about, gosh, life is precious, isn't it? So, there's that dedication to a career. Hats off to you. Well done. Make sure that you do enjoy it and you get something out of it, because that is really important, and that will make a difference to children and young people, won't it? We've all been alongside education staff who've had enough of it.
Yep.
And that doesn't help anyone, does it? And I think the looking after yourself, we just spoke there about recognizing what you're stepping into, agility, resilience, recognizing what you're stepping into, recognizing that's a responsibility, but with humility, recognizing that's a privilege. And I would come back to what I said about I do think that children and young people have never needed good adult role models, that sense of connection, belonging, that support for social skills development and what they can gain through learning more than ever, So this is as an important a role as it ever has. But so holding on to that.
Yeah. And all of that for me links back to, you were talking about self-knowledge earlier, and in the self-evaluation paper, the bit that's included in there too is the self-evaluation with compassion as well, but holding yourself accountable and, being able to be kind to yourself and also honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how we look
Yeah.
after ourselves.
Yeah. And having the laugh when it's needed and coming together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, great. Well, I think, Susie, I've got scribbles all over my notepad here. I think we've covered so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to say that we've not covered, or I've not managed to bring us back to at this point?
No, I don't think so, Gillian.
No.
I'm really honoured. I think the podcasts have been really valuable and easy to listen to. So I'm very pleased and honoured, as I said, that you invited me.
Yeah.
Thank
Oh,
you.
absolutely. It's an absolute privilege. And you were one of the people
Great
I
to
was like,
talk
I
to
really
you.
want to get Susie on. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you so much again for coming on, because I know you're so busy. So this is much appreciated, and I'm sure it'll benefit many others. Thank you again for listening. As ever, your comments and feedback are welcome. You can contact me at edpsychbite@gmail.com. Or also a reminder that there's now opportunity to do that anonymously for my research, which would be great, via a brief form survey or a recorded upload. There's space to suggest improvements and other ideas there too. You can find more information about that at www.gillianorb.com, Gillian with a G and all one word, and I've left the links in the show notes as well. Many thanks again, and I hope your day is a great one.